So Carrie, why don't we start? There's a lot of things I want to cover, although I do want to obviously want to get people's questions answers. But I think one of the main thing that's popping up is this force majeure clause and how that fits in all of these contracts. And then I want to talk. So let's start with that, and then I want you to go through. You and I were talking last night about your 3 pillars, which I thought was excellent. So I want you to go through that, and then based on that little bit of a spiel, I'll go through the questions. I've already got a couple questions ready to go, and we'll get those answered. So Carrie, start off with letting people know force majeure. What is it, and why is it relevant right now?
Sure. So force majeure is a clause in contracts that essentially excuse both parties from performing their obligations under the contract, prohibited from doing so by the Latin term is literally superior force. In other words, something that is beyond the control of both parties. We typically think about this in terms of things like hurricanes, natural disasters. If there's a casualty, in real estate, acts of war. In the past, most people's, so in this country where we've seen it before is force majeure clauses came into effect during 9/11. Hurricane Sandy is a good recent example, Katrina. And in a case like this, this is a little bit unprecedented, but a global pandemic where a state of emergency has been declared and it's legally impossible to perform under a contract.
All right, Carrie, sorry about that. So let's go back to the specific question that some people are asking is, any guidance on how to handle requests from tenants who may want to skip payments on the lease based on this force majeure clause or any other rules that you've been hearing about?
Right. So the first thing we have to do is again, this analysis is always going to start with what does your actual lease with your tenant say? And then the second step is what emergency legislation has been enacted in your jurisdiction. Many cities and counties across the country are enacting specific laws, either tolling evictions during this crisis, or prohibiting landlords, from taking any of defaulting tenants and starting that process, sort of mandating that you give tenants an option, that you give them a rent holiday during this crisis. So we're in unprecedented territory because, again, we've never had a situation in recent memory where we've had legislation that is superseding contractual agreements between parties. But as a general rule, at this point, I think it's difficult for landlords to enforce rent collection under these circumstances. Courts are not in session. Counties are, sending people home. So even in terms of starting to file claims and you can send the notices, but you really can only take the process so far because the courts aren't even open to go ahead and serve process and to take the next steps. I think that as a landlord, as unfair as it is, I think that judges, especially in jurisdictions with special eviction courts, are not going to view you favorably in these circumstances. That said, you do have options. You have tools. And what I would, what I would recommend is if you have tenants, a lot of tenants that are telling you they need a break, especially if they've been tenants that were either good tenants or specifically not bad tenants in the past, I think that you can get out in front of this a little bit and have the conversation with them. And if necessary, try to restructure the lease in that maybe you do give them, if your balance sheet supports it, if you can give them a break, either reduce their rent or give them a rent holiday for 30 to 60 days and then make up the rent going forward on the back end of the lease.
Carrie, and especially regarding that, Dean, you're asking whether that's a rent holiday or postponement, which I think you were about to answer that. So it's not it would eventually have to get picked up on the back end or worked out somehow. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I think that, yes, the sort of the typical way to deal with something like that is if you give them, you give them a break and tell them you don't have to pay April rent, you don't have to pay, maybe you're going to even say May rent, right? Then what you would be looking for is you start escalating, maybe not in July, the first month people hopefully are back at work, but maybe starting in August, you start building it up gradually to make up for the rent that they didn't have to pay. So, right, it's not completely excusing them from rent. It's just allowing them to not pay it right now,
right?
And pay more rent later.
So thanks for that. So why don't you go through? I know you talked about the 3 pillars yesterday, so I think that's part of your 3 pillars. So let's go through the 3 pillars, and then I want to go into specifically the 3 different areas where I think most people on here find themselves in, which is either they're getting into a contract, and so there's a bunch of questions regarding what to put in LOIs or purchase and sale agreements now that you're getting in the contract. Then there's a second group of people who are, in the middle of due diligence and, they're in contract, but they haven't, waived their contingencies. And then there are people who have passed that stage and are now, on their way to close, and they may be trying to figure out what their options are there. So before we go into those things, talk to us a little bit about your 3 pillars, because you and I talked about it yesterday. I thought that was really good stuff. So share with the group what your 3 pillars are.
Sure. Okay. So it is, 1, everything's negotiable. 2, communication is key. And 3, that you have options. You have tools in the toolbox. So the first thing is with respect to that everything is negotiable. There's obviously sort of 3 main stages of a purchase agreement, right? You're negotiating the purchase agreement. You're not yet under contract. You are under contract, but you're doing diligence. You still have contingencies. You have the option to terminate the contract. And the 3rd stage is you've waived those contingencies and you're headed towards closing. While it's fairly obvious that under stages 1 and 2, you still have room to negotiate. Often people think that once they waive contingencies, they're stuck with whatever they have, but that actually isn't true. Even if you've waived all of your contingencies, these are unprecedented circumstances, and so you have leverage. All bets are off at this point. You do have the option to go back and renegotiate and have a conversation with your seller. So I don't know, where do you want me to start with this?
Let's focus on that, since there's no reason we have to go in order. So let's talk about that. So if you've already in contract and you've waived all your contingencies, so you no longer have a finance contingency, no longer you've passed due diligence, everything looked good, at least it looked good last week when you did your due diligence. Now you're closing in 2 weeks. You're telling us that there's still things that you can do if you have second thoughts about the current terms of the contract. If you wanted to either renegotiate, you might be trying to figure out if you're going to pull out of the deal. What are some of the things that you can share with us in terms of what some of the options are? And then as a follow-up to that, I'll tell you right now what happens to our earnest money deposit, because that's great that I can back out, but I've got $100,000 in the bank trapped in the seller, and if the seller doesn't agree with something, obviously it's going to get stuck there. So address those 2 things. What are some of the tools that we have to renegotiate? And then what happens with my earnest money deposit?
Right. So again, we're always going to start with the contract. So the first thing we want to do is look at your PSA and see, is there a force majeure clause? What does it say? Is there a financing contingency? Is there any kind of material adverse change clause in the contract? Any of those 3 things may potentially be an out for you. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, we're ending what was a very long and robust boom market, and a lot of contracts don't have those kinds of provisions because that wasn't on a lot of people's radar. So if you're in that position where you don't have those tools available to you, it's still worth calling up your seller and having a conversation, because the reality is you don't know why your seller put the property on the market. It probably wasn't just for the sake of entertainment, right? They probably have a reason that they need to sell the property. And the reality is this is a situation that's affecting all buyers. And even if it's a really, really valuable offer and he had backup offers or she had backup offers, nobody in their right mind is going to go back to that seller today and give them the same offering price that they did a month ago or even 2 weeks ago. So you do have leverage. And yes, the contract will probably say that if you don't close, you're in default and the seller gets your earnest money. And yes, it is a big risk to you that you could lose your earnest money. But having earnest money and a property on their hands with a note that's maturing and maybe, you know, a property that likely isn't going to appraise out for a refinance based on, you know, the amount of debt they currently have to have on it, or for whatever reason, whatever those reasons they put the property on the market are most likely still real reasons to them that they need to unload it. So having your earnest money, but still having the property in a market that's now incredibly soft, it doesn't help them. And you figure anybody else they bring in isn't going to be ready to close in 2 weeks or a month, right? It's still a 90 to 100 day. And anybody that comes on right now, depending on the market, you know, there's many markets that are on lockdown with nothing other than essential services. So they can't send the lender can't send the appraiser out. The potential new buyer can't inspect the property. You can't do a survey. The title company's not open to issue title. So all of those things are leverage points for you that you're still that seller's best bet to close on the acquisition of that property and do it fastest. So in that situation, assuming you don't want to walk away completely, like, right, you have the power to call them up and say, look, this is crazy. My lender can't move quickly. This doesn't pencil out anymore. They've reduced my loan. Whatever your issue is, have the conversation with the seller. They know what's going on. They're nervous too. And, you know, if both people come in with good intentions and an attempt and are actually, you know, looking to be fair, right? 9 times out of 10, you're going to get to a deal. The fact that, you know, especially if you don't have a lender that's willing, you know, if your lender can't, won't make the loan or is on hold, you're not alone. He's going to understand that. So you can't perform.
Yeah.
Even if he takes your earnest money, you can't perform. What's he going to do?
Yeah. I think that's just such a great point, Carrie, because that's really the main reason I wanted to do this webinar, is because a lot of people are kind of getting scared and freaking out, and they think that their only option is, I'm just going to back out. So I've been hearing people backing out and even just saying, you know, forget it, I'm going to lose my earnest money deposit, but I'd rather lose my earnest money deposit than go through with the current terms of the contract because I don't know what's going on. And I think the important lesson here is you don't have to do that. That's certainly an option you may have if you want to walk away, but that doesn't mean that's not your only option. You can definitely go back, renegotiate, you know, let them know, look, the due diligence has changed. Obviously, occupancy, especially economic vacancy, right? That's probably changed quite a bit since 2 weeks ago. So all of these are things that you can discuss with the seller. And I can't stress enough. I mean, just put yourself in the shoes. I don't know if anybody's here selling right now, but if there is somebody who's a seller, by the way, just drop me a note here. But, you know, if you're a seller in this market, you know, who wants to wait? Who wants to take the risk that you drop out and then you go to your backup offer, or you just start the process again and you're not going to close for another 90 days? Who knows what the market's going to look like in 90 days, and maybe they don't even get the price that they want. So I think that's all of that leverage stuff is really important. Let me just a couple of questions on that point, Carrie. Travis was asking, it's great to hear options to place in the purchase and sale agreement to exit the deal. What about options to put into the purchase and sale agreement to extend closing, to ride out this unknown time? So this might be either, I guess this might be a situation. So let's go this way. I can see this in 2 scenarios. One scenario is you're about to get in a contract. Well, what are the options you can put into the purchase and sale to extend closing and kind of ride out this process? I also think it fits into what we're talking now, which is you're already in contract, but you guys agree to amend. What does that amendment look like in terms of the contract amendment? What provision should we be putting in there at the time of executing either the new PSA or the amended PSA?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, everybody, I think this goes without saying, everybody negotiating contracts right now, you need a force majeure clause. And I would go even further than the boilerplate force majeure. I would specifically include global pandemics, COVID-19, or similar situations. So That's the first thing. I would also include a financing contingency. In a boom economy, it's tougher to get that in there, but the reality is lenders are moving more slowly and they're nervous. And so I would want, if I'm a buyer, I want to know that even if I waive diligence, most lenders have in a good economy, a lender is going to tell you they have anywhere from a 45 to 60 day underwriting period. In this economy, most of them are taking longer, not because they're trying to be difficult or because they don't like buyers or don't want to do the deal, but they're on skeleton crews, people are working remotely, access to the property, the ability to get an appraiser out there. All of that has been slowed down. And so there's a good chance that you're going to be finalizing your financing after you've waived your contingencies for diligence on the actual property. So put in a financing contingency. If your lender pulls out, you need the option to kill the deal. And again, you're trying to do a deal in this economy. Your seller, they know they're not going to push back. And even if they push back once, they're not going to push back twice. I don't think you should have any trouble getting those two provisions in the deal.
Yeah, and actually, and thanks, Tariq, for making a comment. There are some. So I'm seeing actually both sides. So let's talk about both sides. I mean, we're not here to say there's one way is correct and one way isn't. In fact, I should have started, if we hadn't had all these technical difficulties that threw me off a little bit, I was going to remind everyone that the purpose of this webinar is really to get the options, right? It's not to give business advice or investment advice. So this is just to show you what your options are. But somebody was saying, hey, we're negotiating on the sales side and they're being very flexible. So yeah, we have a seller that's on here now that is being super flexible to the buyer, kind of letting, kind of confirming what Carrie's saying. But then, Michael, I see that you said that, you're in a deal and, many sellers, Carrie, talk about this. Many sellers will simply just refinance at these rates as opposed to selling. So if they feel like, things are in adverse conditions now, they're not going to freak out because they're just like, hey, we'll just go get a refinance because Fannie and Freddie are still wide open. What are your thoughts on that?
There are many sellers that are going to do that. And I think there's a lot of sellers that out of the gate are going to say, like, that's the response to, hello, global pandemic. My lender's not at work. My, capital markets are not as robust as they used to be. And you're right. That's the other side of the argument as well. That's fine. We can refinance and hold. And admittedly, there are going to be some sellers that are in that position. That said, we're going into, regardless of what happens with this, we are going into a recession economy. And there's a good portion of the sellers out there in this market that acquired these properties in a great economy. So even refinancing, yes, it's an option for some. It's not an option for all of them. The deals, when you talk about refinancing, can they definitely pull out of it? Can they cover their debt? Because I think the days of, one of the things that we saw in the aftermath of 2008 is that the loan to value ratios decreased. Right. So if you overpaid or you paid a higher price for the property than it's appraising right now, you have to build in that there's going to be more vacancies, right? Some tenants are going to be forced out. What does that look like? And you're right. And for some sellers, it is going to make more sense to refinance, and you as a buyer, that's a tough one for you to argue. But if you are a buyer and you have a contract and you are ready, willing, and able to perform pursuant to the terms of the contract, the seller doesn't, force majeure doesn't give the seller the option to change their mind for a better deal. Force majeure does not mean the economy changed and now I get and now this isn't the best economic deal I can make, so I want to pull out. That is not the point of that clause. That's not how it's been interpreted by the courts in the past.
Carrie, let me just a couple of follow-ups on that. Force majeure in general, is that a standard mortgage clause? This is Dean's question. Is this a standard mortgage clause or part of common law?
It derives from common law, and it is in the mortgage clause. And if you read your mortgage, you will, or loan agreement, if your loan documents are a loan agreement, you will find that those documents are several hundred pages of trying to contemplate every possible eventuality, and they will include a force majeure. For you as a borrower, that force majeure is a certain amount of protection, right? There's some other clauses in there that are going to be more problematic for you as a borrower. And if you are on Laser Pro loan documents, which a lot of $3 to $5 million deals or deals under 5 million often are, or in the Fannie, Freddie, and HUD programs, there's most likely a clause, a general, either a material adverse change clause or a general insecurity clause. And insecurity is literally says, I mean, the Laser Pro document clause says, if the lender feels insecure in this loan for any reason or no reason, we can call it. So how about that?
Wow. Wow.
Right. So basically what I will tell you is, as a borrower, the loan documents are scary. They have all kinds of provisions, and they typically are to, you know, it's a whole document geared to do one thing: protect the lender, give them the right to take the property or operate the property, and protect their loan to you. You have very few rights under it. That said, I'm going to go back to one of the pillars. Everything is negotiable, and communication is key. So sticking your head in the sand is not the thing to do right now. The best thing you can do is get on the phone and talk to your lender. Because here's the deal. If they want to take the property, if it hasn't been performing, if they, for whatever reason, want to get out of the loan, they have a million ways to do that under the loan documents. But lenders are not in the business of owning and operating property. REO is not a great situation for lenders. They still, like, you know, even in 2008, you know, one of the reasons that the market jammed up was because they didn't want to own the property. It took them about 2 years to start actually foreclosing on stuff. So if you reach out to them and you call them and you have the conversation, this isn't going to be a surprise. You are not a delinquent or derelict buyer, right? Like, they know what's going on. So get on the phone with your lender. Ideally, get on the phone, get out ahead of it. You don't want it going to a special servicer, because then you're in line with 75 other non-performing loans. That's a morass that if you don't have to deal with, it's better. Call them up now and tell them, you know, I'm concerned. Right now, my tenants are paying rent, but I'm getting a lot of requests for a rent holiday. You know, my tenants, especially if you have Class C or workforce property, or a property that's, you know, your tenant base largely comes from a single employer. If it's like a large industrial employer, say it's a car manufacturer, right? They're shutting down operations. If you're in a community, or you can show that, you know, there's a disproportionate hit to your property, have the conversation with your lender now. What's your advice to me? How do we handle this? This is how I'm thinking about handling it. I don't want to lose my tenants. I don't want to force them out and have 50% vacancy next year in a soft economy and having to fill 50% of the units at lower rental rates. I'd rather keep them in now, but in order to restructure their rents, I need you to help me restructure my mortgage, right? And a lot of municipalities are, as I said, they've enacted legislation. They're giving holidays. Lenders don't know what's coming down the pike, but they'll have the conversation with you. And I mean, you would be shocked that I can't, you know, again, we can't promise, but historically, lenders have responded favorably to that.
Carrie, let's talk about that, because I was going to ask you that, and Michael just followed up with that. You know, you've obviously, this is not your first rodeo. I had to remind you, and as I see some of the faces on here, that there are some youngsters in the crowd that you know, may have been in their early 20s back in the last recession. But you know, this is your third major recession, 9/11, and then the 08 crisis. Now this is the third. You've been doing this for 20 plus years. Michael was asking, look, there can be a lot of fear around lenders calling loans during hard times. You know, how common was this in the past recessions?
Actually, it was a problem that they didn't call loans in the past recession. I mean, in general, I think economists would tell you that, you know, money and cash flow is a loop, right? It's a symbiotic process. So the economies, there's downturns, but things that are catastrophic for an economy is when the money engine just grinds to a halt, when people stop and stand still and do nothing. That's why times like 9/11 and 2008 were the reason they were so problematic is not because prices went down or unemployment went up. It's because people stopped. Things stopped. And in 2008, what the banking system did was, first, everybody was just sort of shell-shocked, and then they weren't foreclosing on properties. So people were left in limbo for like 2 years, right? Banks went under, they hadn't met their deposits, they stopped making loans, and the Fed kind of fumbled it. I think, and if you want to understand 2008, I would highly recommend the movie The Big Short. It's a really good layman's description and explanation. It's also funny, of what happened. Or you can go on NPR, and they had I think it was Ira Glass and This American Life had a really good analysis as well. It was like a 3-part series, and so I think all in it was under an hour. But the point is, in the past, the banks didn't close loans quickly, and then they ended up with all of this REO property that they didn't want, and they basically called up, a lot of the regional banks, and they ended up calling up some of their better clients and kind of putting it out there, and they had to get rid of it. And they weren't prepared to do it. I mean, the biggest education I ever had about how to underwrite and pro forma real estate was getting stacks of loan files from regional banks in the Midwest, and of loans that weren't performing, and having to go through. And let me assure you, when your lawyer's going through your construction budget line by line to figure out how something went sideways, that is not a good situation. We are not good at math. And going through and seeing construction budgets that were just a disaster, like apartment complexes that had no line items for appliances. That was my personal favorite, right? That project wasn't going to work in any economy, but lenders made loans because they weren't holding the paper. They've learned those lessons from '08. And so do I think lenders are going, are they going to start calling loans not on performing properties? Probably not. They don't want to own your property for you. They don't want to be stuck holding the bag. They don't want to have to operate it. They do not want obligations to tenants. There's a lot of laws that protect residential tenants. And then they don't want to have to unload it at cents on the dollar. And then the feds come in, and the feds start telling them and making sure that they're doing everything right. And that is not a pleasant experience for banks. They do not like being subject to regulators. So no. And again, the best thing you can do to avoid being a victim of your mortgage's insecurity or material adverse change clause is get on the phone with your lender now.
Hey, Carrie,
proactive.
Carrie, can you talk a little bit about, I've got a couple of questions that are coming in that I want to get to as well, but I'm not sure why it's not. But can you talk about, you've mentioned material adverse changes clauses a few times. Can you just let us know what those is? Assume that we don't know what that is. We've talked about force majeure. How is a material adverse change clause different from a force majeure, and what is it?
A material adverse change clause is another wonderfully broad and vague clause that lenders put in documents, sort of similar to an insecurity clause. It's a little more specific in that it says something along the lines of, in the event that there's a material adverse change to the property such that it doesn't appraise well, or we don't think it's going to perform, or it is unable to perform as projected, we can call the loan. Now, when those were originally put in, it was not in case we have a global pandemic or a Great Depression or, like something sort of, the economy comes to a halt. It's typically saying something like it was intended to apply to things like the municipality changes the zoning and this can no longer be operated as residential, right? So like we saw a lot of that in the 70s when factories went out of the inner cities and into the suburbs, and areas that were residential got zoned industrial. So you couldn't have people living there. Or in the vice versa, you look at places like the Arts District in LA, right, which used to be an industrial place, and then developers started buying lots and converting them to like live workspace. So now a material adverse change is that you can't operate a factory in the Arts District, right? So if you have a loan on a property that where 10 years ago or 20 years ago the loan was made on an operating factory, and now the zoning's changed and the factory can't operate there. That said, lenders have broadened. I mean, that's what it was initially drafted to address, but now once it's in there, the language is vague enough that they'll say anything, right? So in this situation where the economy comes to a halt and you all of a sudden, you have huge vacancy rates or you have big delinquency rates, just based on the strength of the contract, the lender has the option to call the loan. Remember that for you as a borrower, that's a terrifying prospect, but recognize that those documents, Mauricio, we talk about how when you do a PPM, you're always, that's the shield to your syndicators, right? And you like to contemplate every terrible thing that could happen so that to protect the syndicator. Well, the loan document is a similar type of document designed to protect your lender. So it gives them every possible opportunity to basically call the loan and take the property. But in order to do that, essentially what they have to do is they have to foreclose. And right now there's a hiatus on foreclosures. Then they have to go spend money on lawyers to go litigate that, right? And yes, for you, it's money out of pocket because you have to defend that. But the point is, it means that the lenders foreclosing on the property isn't, and calling the loan is not their first option. Their first option is restructuring your note so that you can keep paying something and they don't have to go through the process of that.
Got it. Hey, Carrie, I want to get some of these questions, and I want to be cognizant of time as well. I'm going to go with my tocayo. So anybody called Mauricio is going to get a good sum here. So, hey, Mauricio, he said, just got my offer accepted. What should I add to my purchase agreement to protect myself? Maybe, I know we talked a little bit about it here and there. Maybe we can just kind of put it into a nice package. What things should we look for to add to your purchase agreement once you've got an LOI accepted?
Force majeure, a new and improved COVID-19 force majeure clause, and a new robust COVID-19 financing contingency.
And we'll email you. We'll email you kind of samples of those clauses for you guys so that you guys can look at it. Hopefully you guys have real estate attorneys that are probably doing it for you, but we're happy to send out what we're using for our clients. So that's good stuff. And on the force majeure, Carrie, another question that came up was, can a force majeure clause, Richard, can a force majeure clause in the purchase and sale agreement or a commercial lease that only speaks to protecting the seller or the landlord, can that be applied to the buyer or the tenant as well? Meaning, does it apply to either side? Or if it's drafted a certain way, it can it be one-sided?
Now, the point of force majeure is to protect both parties. There are some elements of it that are sort of pro one side or the other. For example, most force majeure clauses that are well crafted, if you will, would require, for example, the lack of access to go on for a certain number of days, consecutive days, and it will talk about things that don't constitute force majeure as well. So, for example, the fact that a well-drafted force majeure clause would have a provision that would say you have to have lack of access for 30 consecutive days would typically be sort of pro-landlord and against tenant, right?
A couple of, hey, I love this. Greedy question, Dean. Great question. Greedy question. Any tips on how to develop relationship with banks to try and take over non-performing notes or help them avoid REO through acquisition? So there's obviously a lot of folks that see an opportunity here. Any tips on how to establish relationships with banks? Or is it too late? Is that something you establish over the years and that's something you got to kind of like broker relationship, right? Those take a little while to develop. Any thoughts on that, Carrie?
Yeah. So a number of ways to it. First of all, it's never too late. But you do highlight the fact that even in this no-touch world, your personal relationships are your most important assets. So you should always be cultivating them. So brokers, have relationships with lenders. Approach brokers, your lawyers have relationships with lenders. Talk to us. Talk to, if you've got existing assets, even if it's a Fannie, Freddie, you have a mortgage broker that plays that. So wherever you got your last financing, reach out to them. And then the other thing is find the industry events in your area, right? Real Estate Investment Association is a good one. Go to your, if you're in boot camps, reach out to your mentors in your boot camps. But in your area, Google it, go get involved with the various real estate industry groups. If you're if you're female, CREW, Commercial Real Estate Women, is a national organization with some very big heavy hitters in the real estate industry, but there's also a lot of lenders are active in that group. ICSC, even though you're in the multifamily space, ICSC, International Conference of Shopping Center Professionals, is a huge one. NAUP is another one. Like, there's all kinds of organizations out there. Find them, start going. They have breakfasts, a lot of them. They have, at a restaurant where they'll have panels. Get involved. Even if it's not in your asset class, there will be industry professionals there, and the bankers go to all of them. So that's a really good, and they always have networking and mixers, and they'll be doing more of this now rather than less.
Sounds good. A couple of questions just popped up, but I had one already ready to go. I feel like this is rapid fire, so appreciate you, Carrie. We've talking about all these, this is Devin, sorry. If you're intending on putting all these special contingencies in your PSA, the ones we've talked about, the force majeure, the financing, the material adverse changes, is that something that you should also put in your LOI?
Sure, yes. I mean, okay. A month ago, I would have told you, if you look at any real estate broker's form purchase agreement, there is a financing contingency option that you can check the box on, and there's typically a force majeure clause. A lot of times in a hot market, those are kind of the first clauses to be struck. But these aren't unusual clauses, right? So what I would have told you a month ago is maybe don't put that in an LOI, because there's a lot of competitions to get your offer accepted. But I'd negotiate them into your purchase agreement during that stage of the deal. Today, what I will say to you is, you're not asking for anything unusual. These clauses didn't just materialize in this environment. They've been around forever, and there's a reason. So one, you should be putting them in your agreement. And two, again, it's the 900-pound gorilla in the room, right? Like, put it in the LOI. Like, be forthright with your seller. Your seller is not going to not accept your LOI because you're saying we're going to need a force majeure clause.
I've got a lot of people asking for, sorry, I'm going to just, you know what, I'm going to do this. Somebody was asking for a list. I know you rattled off that list pretty quick, and this will be recorded so you can go back to it, but let me just, I was going to put your contact info. So if they want to get a list of that, I'll put that at the end, I'll figure it out, but that was one of the things. Question was, I understand COVID-19 references in the context of a force majeure, but what is the context of a COVID-19 regarding a loan contingency?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean, why would you want a financing contingency in your PSA, or? Randy,
I'm going to unmute you. You want to ask it? Wait, if I can, unmute you. Hold on. The only reason I'm going to unmute him because you're on video, so I wanted to, there you go.
Okay, great, thanks. So I just wanted, I understand COVID-19 being referenced in the context of a force majeure clause, but I'm not sure I understand what referencing COVID-19 has to do with a loan contingency.
Meaning that, I mean, you don't have to, but I think it's helpful to be more specific in this circumstances. So what I would want your contingency to say is that in the event your lender pulls out of, in the event you are unable to secure financing for any reason, including the global economic turndown and the uncertainty resulting from this unprecedented global pandemic. So that it can't be, it's what it is it's your retreat position, right? What I'd like you to have is a provision that says, if you can't find the financing for any reason or no reason, for whatever, under any circumstances, if you can't find a loan that makes sense on terms that make sense for you, you can walk. A lot of sellers are going to say, you got to work with me because you will have tied up the property for 90 to 120 days. If you can't, if you're not financeable, I got to move on to the next buyer. And so your retreat position is, okay, if it's not about me being financeable, but it's about this global pandemic, we're all in this together. I got to be able to get out of the deal.
Thanks, Carrie. Hey, on the force majeure, Matt just asked, is force majeure still in effect if it's already happened or is happening when the contract is signed? So if we enter into a contract while this coronavirus has already started, does it make the force majeure moot?
Great question. No, it doesn't. And that's one of the reasons I would specifically want us, referencing COVID-19, and what I'd want to say is, something along the lines of acknowledging that this is going on and it's unprecedented and the parties don't know where it's going to go. In the event that circumstances arise that make this deal untenable for either party. I'm not, in this environment, I'm not using my standard force majeure clause. I'm specifically tailoring it, recognizing that things that go under contract now, yes, we're in it, and it's hard to go back and say, well, you didn't know about it. But this also, we don't know where this is going to go. We don't know what's going to happen. And so both sides need to be protected for unforeseen results of this particular crisis, because we're nowhere near the end of it.
Cool. And then, by the way, somebody just popped in. Tariq, thanks that, someone's under contract to buy one of the lenders, and the lender changed the terms after the rate lock and now wants 6 months of payments in escrow at close. So obviously the lenders are getting nervous. You want to comment on that, Carrie? Is that something typical? We are under contract to buy one, and the lender changed terms after the rate lock and now wants 6 months of payments in escrow at close. Is that something you typically see?
I mean, yes, and I'm encouraged by the fact that they just wanted 6 months. In 2008, I had a number of clients that were ready to close, and the banks just said, "We're not doing it. You're welcome to sue us. We realize we're breaching our own term sheet, but we're being taken over." Or, we're just not going to do it. And obviously, that's a situation where borrowers had all the rights under the law and none of them were a business solution to their problem. So, we got on the phone. That's where we used communication. We got on the phone and explained the situation to our sellers. We got extensions. Some of them we got out. Some of them we discounted and they kept a portion of the earnest money and we got the rest of it back. And we went out and we found alternative financing. We did a lot of EB5. We did a lot of HUD. We did a lot of private raises. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So yes, you're going to see a lot of that. And the question is, does it pencil for you? And again, that's a situation where even if you don't have any contingencies under your contract, take that email, take that letter, get on the phone with your seller, show it to them. And if you have to connect the dots, explain to them that any other buyer that comes down the line is most likely going to have this situation. So it behooves them to work with you to extend or help you shop it around and find different financing.
Good stuff. I just actually got a question. Rabita, just email me somebody asking me an asset protection question, which I'm happy to answer, but let's do that offline. Any asset protection questions, you can just email me at Mauricio@premierlawgroup.net. And then same with Carrie, by the way. If you guys want Carrie to take a look at a contract or give you kind of quick feedback on it, feel free to email her at Carrie@premierlawgroup.net. I'll put it on the chat if I can figure out how to do it. But Carrie@premierlawgroup.net, she's told me she's happy to review your language or whatever. Because a lot of this, go through that. I think you talked a little bit about it earlier, Carrie, but like step one is looking at the contract, right? I mean, we can talk about all these provisions, but we always start with going to look at your actual specific contract and your specific language. And that's always step one, right? Yep,
exactly.
Cool. Where's my other question here? Oh, thanks, Bethany. Bethany knows what she's doing. So she put her email on there. Sorry, guys, I've been going. Let me go back to the beginning. I know there's some questions. If you've got other questions, pop them in there. I know there was some at the beginning that I'm sorry I skipped. So I think we've answered this one, but Brent, if we're under contract without a force majeure, what options do we have to get out?
Walking away altogether is a little bit difficult preemptively, right? It's easier to say if you can't get financing and you can demonstrate that you're financeable and you've been doing everything in your power to find a financing option, you can't do it. But just full on walking away is a little bit difficult because it does sort of leave the seller in the lurch, and sellers are very nervous right now, right? So the options, I think, are if you tell me I can do the deal, but I can't do it on these terms. I can do it at this purchase price. I can do it with maybe seller financing. if you give me anything to work with in a way that the deal makes sense for you, then I can, between you and me, I can probably get, we can work on cajoling your seller and getting them to understand that this is the deal on the table now, that circumstances have changed in a way no one could have predicted, and that you're trying to do a deal. That demonstrates good faith and a willingness. And again, if the deal you can do doesn't make sense for the seller, but you've tried really hard and they see that you are really operating in good faith, it really increases the likelihood that they're going to let you out of the contract with your earnest money, or with a good portion of your earnest money.
Carrie, actually, it's funny. So this is actually a Brent question. Brent, obviously we can talk about this next week, but I think it's a good question for the group, which it's the flip side. What if in his particular case, what if the financing, well, let's assume it's not even a bank. So there's obviously if it's a bank, but you may have a private lender. What if the lender is trying to pull out of the deal? What if the lender's trying to get out of the deal? So you've locked the rates, you kind of agreed everything, and now the lender's trying to take the position that they don't want to lend on your product, especially if they're hard money lenders. They may not like the LTV or the perceived LTV. Any thoughts on that?
Again, I'd want to see what your loan commitment looks like. I want to see what the language is. And typically, your option as a borrower, if the lender tries to kind of backpedal or renege on their deal, is, you have a contract claim and you can file it. Most lenders are banking on the fact that as a borrower, economically, it's not going to make sense for you to try to sue a lender for pulling out of your deal. And you have to ultimately be able to show damages, right? Which maybe would be your earnest money, but again, that's probably not going to make it. The cost benefit analysis probably means it doesn't make sense. But again, let's look at it. And sometimes filing a claim isn't about pursuing litigation. It's about getting them to the table and helping people. I like to say that contracts exist to help people keep their promises to each other. And so sometimes filing that claim or threatening litigation is really, it's a negotiating tool to get your lender to the table to stop acting like a jerk and actually honor their commitment.
Carrie, Richard was asking, besides these legal clauses, all these discussions about the legal clauses, any thoughts on several possible scenarios you might foresee on CRE and capital markets based on your experience in the past? Let me read that again. Besides these legal clauses, do you have any thoughts on several possible scenarios you might foresee on CRE and capital markets / banks based on your prior experience with these crises?
Sure. So the three pillars that I mentioned are what I learned from the last recession. And that's largely based on what banks did. I think that the one thing I will say is, the feds are being proactive. They cut rates. The benefit of cutting rates, there is no benefit to cutting rates if banks aren't going to loan money, right? And this administration does seem very much, they seem very cognizant of where the government received criticism for their handling of 2008. And one of the big places of criticism in 2008, right, was that there were bank bailouts, and then banks took the bailout and they didn't make loans to Main Street, and quote unquote, average Americans were really left out of that. And so if you notice the plans and what the stimulus that we're seeing now, that from both parties, right, is they want to give checks to everybody, right? They cut rates. Fannie and Freddie did a huge volume last week. So I think that the administration is going to put a tremendous amount of pressure on banks to continue making loans. I don't think at this point, I would be surprised if we ended up with the lack of liquidity that was so crippling in 2008. What I do think we are going to see are lower loan to value ratios. I think that they're gonna want bigger reserves. You're already seeing that. I think that they're going to want, I think the non-recourse loan is going to be much more difficult to get. I think they are going to be looking for personal guarantees. They're probably going to need more KPs. That's kind of what I see. And I think that the process, you know, I think we all have to buckle our seatbelts for a longer process of underwriting. And I think, you know, softer markets, right? I mean, I think we have to recognize that if we're sellers, you know, our properties, I mean, you're not going to be able to get, I think the amount that, it's going to go back to that loan to value ratio, right? And so I think the loans are going to be smaller, which will drive down prices. And I think that we have to be more conservative in how we perform the deals, and we have to assume higher vacancy rates. And that's in the near term. But I think also, you know, you guys are in the multifamily space, and I think that's a great place to be, because people need a place to live. And so I think that the first-time home buyer market is going to take a hit, right? I think you're going to see more people renting for longer. And so, but again, all of those types of and cultural changes, that's not going to happen in 3 months, right? That's what we're going to be seeing in six to 18 months down the road, right? So what you need to be thinking about in the long term is, how can I be the best potential borrower on a project? And that involves, you know, building a bigger contingency for vacancy rates, right? Lower the loan to value that you need to borrow, and leverage to your investors. What you can leverage is the really low rates, and I think rates are going to stay low.
I think I've gotten all your questions. I may have, look, I've got so many chats here that if I haven't answered your question, if you don't mind, put it in again. But I think I got to all of you guys. But if you've got any last minute questions here, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Still shocked that there's this many people listening to a bunch of lawyers. So good job, Carrie. One more question here. Rabita, let's talk about a line. That's sort of an asset protection question. You know, what's the best place to incorporate a single property, and what are the best places to incorporate the holding corpus for multiple single properties? Happy to answer that. Why don't we do that offline, Rabita? Because that's kind of a little bit different topic. So Rama asked, should we buy now or wait for 90 days? That's a business call, my friend. You know, we're not here to give you business advice. You know, it's funny, when I used to, you know, when I worked at the law firm back in the day, we would give a little bit of advice. Then I went to work in-house for the real estate guys, and I learned really quickly that my job was to make sure the guys had all of the options available to them, and then they would look at my legal conclusions, and then they can make their own business decision. It's no different than, you know, when you're giving your disclosures to your investors. You know, you want to make sure they have all the information so that they can make an intelligent decision. They can evaluate the risks and the merits of the deal. Same here. So that's a personal opinion. Should we buy now or wait for 90 days? Who the hell knows? Let's see. Any difference in contract language to protect a syndication versus a private purchase? It's a good question. Should we be looking on the real estate side, Carrie, anything different that you would be putting in the contracts if it was a syndication, or whether you were just buying a 15-unit complex on your own or with a couple partners?
Not really. I mean, if I know it's a syndication, it really comes back to, I mean, that syndication is part of your financing, as part of your capital stack. So I'm gonna out of the gate, I'm gonna want to make sure that my financing contingencies for my buyers contemplates their financing, and I'm not going to make it specific to an institutional lender, right? Yeah. So no, I think, you know, I think it all comes back to recognizing the role that is part of the capital stack.
Does everybody have, in case you guys have any, look, we're going to release the recording of this, but if there's any other questions that you guys have, can you guys all see the email? I know Bethany put it in there because for some reason, I feel like if I do something, it'll screw it up or something. But if you want to get a hold of Carrie, Carrie at premierlawgroup.net. And then what we'll do probably on Monday is we'll email everyone sort of our kind of what we're using for clients on that clause. for the force majeure clause and the specific language on COVID-19. Although I found out today that COVID-19 is actually the name of the disease, not the name of the virus, interestingly enough. The virus is actually called SARS-C-2 or something. It's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, unless there's any last minute questions, I think it's been over an hour. So I think I'm going to let it go, give you a few more seconds. But Carrie, thanks so much for taking the time on Saturday. I appreciate that. And thanks everybody for coming on. And any questions, let us know. If not, we'll keep putting some value. Look at the Facebook page. We'll put as much value as we can over the next couple of weeks and help everybody through. All right, guys. Appreciate you guys all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.